The wind howled across the Wyoming plains like a wounded animal, driving snow horizontal against the weathered walls of Sunset Ranch. Samuel McKenna pulled his coat tighter as he made his way from the barn to the main house, his boots crunching through the fresh powder that had been falling since dawn. At 52, his once broad shoulders now carried the weight of 10 years' worth of solitude, and his graying beard couldn't hide the deep lines etched by grief around his pale blue eyes. The ranch house, built with his own hands 25 years ago when hope still lived in his chest, groaned under the assault of the winter storm. Paint peeled from its wooden siding, and several shutters hung askew, repairs he'd been meaning to make for months, maybe years. Time had lost its meaning since Margaret died, each day bleeding into the next in an endless cycle of basic survival and hollow routine. "Boss!" Jake's voice cut through the wind as the old foreman emerged from the bunkhouse, his weathered face nearly invisible beneath a fur-lined hat. "Storm's getting worse. Radio says it might last 3 days." Samuel nodded grimly. 3 days meant they'd lose more cattle, maybe some of the horses if the temperature dropped much further. He'd already lost so much over the years, first Margaret and their unborn child, then slowly, piece by piece, his will to maintain what they'd built together. The ranch that once supported 30 head of cattle now struggled with half that number. As he reached for the door handle of his house, a movement caught his eye through the swirling snow. A figure stumbled along the main road leading to his property, someone on foot in this weather, which meant they were either desperate or dead within the hour. "Jake, you see that?" Samuel squinted into the white darkness. The foreman followed his gaze and swore under his breath. "Somebody's out there, boss." "We better—" Before Jake could finish, the figure collapsed about 50 yards from the house. Samuel felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. The old instinct to help, to act, to care about another human being's welfare. Without thinking, he plunged into the storm. The snow was knee-deep in places, and the wind tried to push him backward with each step. When he reached the fallen figure, he found a woman, unconscious and nearly blue with cold. She couldn't have been more than 35, with dark hair plastered to her head, and wearing clothes that marked her as a traveler. A long coat over a practical dress, sturdy boots, and a small leather satchel clutched in her frozen hands. "Ma'am." Samuel knelt beside her, checking for signs of life. Her pulse was weak but steady, her breathing shallow. She needed warmth immediately. Without hesitation, he lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he'd expected, and something about her reminded him of Margaret's delicate frame, though this woman's hands were calloused from work, and her face bore the kind of determined set that spoke of someone who'd faced hardship before. The journey back to the house felt endless, but Jake was already holding the door open, and within minutes they had her on the couch in front of the fireplace. Samuel hadn't used the main room in months, preferring to take his meals and spend his evenings in the kitchen, but now he quickly built up the fire while Jake fetched blankets. "Should I ride for the doc?" Jake asked, though they both knew Doc Harrison lived 20 miles away in town, and the roads would be impassable. "Storm's too bad," Samuel replied, kneeling beside the woman as he wrapped her in wool blankets. "We'll have to do what we can." As if summoned by his words, her eyes fluttered open, dark brown, almost black, with flecks of gold that caught the firelight. She tried to sit up, panic flashing across her features as she took in her surroundings. "Easy now," Samuel said gently, his voice rusty from disuse. "You're safe. I'm Samuel McKenna, and this is my ranch. You collapsed in the storm." She studied his face carefully, as if measuring his character in a single glance. "Elena," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Elena Rodriguez, thank you." "Where were you headed in weather like this?" Jake asked, his tone suspicious. Strangers were rare in this part of Wyoming, especially traveling alone in winter. Elena's eyes darted between the two men, and Samuel could see her calculating how much to reveal. "California," she said finally. "I was trying to reach the train station in Cheyenne, but my horse threw a shoe about 10 miles back. I thought I could walk it, but the storm—" Samuel nodded. It was a plausible story, though something in her eyes suggested there was more to it. But that was her business. Right now she needed food, rest, and warmth. "You'll stay until the storm passes," he said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "The guest room upstairs is clean. Jake, can you ask Maria to prepare some soup?" As Jake headed for the kitchen where their cook would be preparing dinner, Samuel found himself really looking at another person for the first time in years. Elena Rodriguez had pulled herself up to a sitting position, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. Despite her ordeal, there was a quiet strength in her posture, a dignity that even exhaustion couldn't diminish. "I don't want to impose," she said. "If you could just—" "You'll impose," Samuel interrupted, then softened his tone. "The storm will last days. Nobody travels in weather like this and lives. You're welcome here." Something passed between them in that moment. Not attraction exactly, but a recognition. Two people who had learned to carry their burdens alone, now sharing the same roof as the Wyoming winter raged outside. Samuel felt the first crack in the wall he'd built around his heart, and it scared him more than any storm ever could. To Chapter 2, Wounds and Healing, Eleanor woke to the smell of coffee and bacon drifting up from the kitchen below. Sunlight streamed through the guest room window, revealing a landscape transformed by snow into something almost magical. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a world of pristine white that stretched endlessly toward the mountains. She sat up slowly, her body still aching from yesterday's ordeal. The room was simple but comfortable, a brass bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a ceramic basin, and a rocking chair by the window. On the nightstand, someone had left a clean towel and a bar of soap that smelled like lavender. The thoughtfulness of the gesture surprised her. As she dressed in the same clothes from yesterday, now dry but wrinkled, Elena caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the washstand. Her dark hair was a mess, and there were shadows under her eyes, but she was alive. If Samuel McKenna hadn't found her when he did, she would have died in that storm. The kitchen was warm and filled with the comfortable sounds of morning, coffee percolating, eggs sizzling in a pan, and quiet conversation between Samuel and an older Mexican woman who must be Maria, the cook Jake had mentioned. "Buenos dias," Maria said warmly as Eleanor appeared in the doorway. She was a plump woman with kind eyes and flour dusting her apron. "Sit, sit. You need to eat." Samuel looked up from his place at the table, and Elena was struck again by how handsome he must have been before grief carved those lines around his eyes. His hair was sandy brown with gray at the temples, and despite his isolation, he'd maintained the broad-shouldered build of a man who worked with his hands. "How are you feeling?" he asked, standing to pull out a chair for her. "Better, thank you." Elena sat down, accepting the plate Maria placed in front of her, eggs, bacon, toast, and hash browns. Her stomach growled loudly, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. "I can't thank you enough for taking me in." "Any decent person would have done the same," Samuel replied, but Elena caught the way his gaze lingered on her face. "Roads should be clear enough for travel by tomorrow, maybe the day after." Was that disappointment she heard in his voice? Elena studied him as she ate, noting the careful way he held himself, the politeness that seemed to mask deeper feelings. This was a man who had learned to keep the world at arm's length. "Actually," she said, setting down her fork, "I was wondering if you might need some help around here, just until I can earn enough for train fare." Samuel's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. "Help?" Elena looked around the kitchen, then back at him. "I'm a hard worker, and I have some experience with caring for people. I noticed yesterday that you have a cut on your hand that looks infected." Samuel instinctively tucked his left hand under the table, but not before Eleanor saw the dirty bandage wrapped around his palm. "It's nothing. Cut it on some wire last week." "May I see it?" "I said it's nothing." The sharpness in his voice would have deterred most people, but Eleanor had dealt with stubborn patients before. She stood up and moved around the table, extending her hand palm up. "Please." Something in her tone, gentle but firm, made Samuel hesitate. After a moment, he reluctantly placed his injured hand in hers. Eleanor unwrapped the bandage carefully, revealing a deep gash across his palm that was indeed infected, the edges red and swollen. "When did you last clean this?" she asked, her voice professional and matter-of-fact. "Few days ago, I think. It needs proper cleaning and fresh bandages, or you could lose the use of your hand." Elena looked directly into his pale blue eyes. "I know what I'm doing. I trained as a nurse." Samuel studied her face, seeing something there that made him want to trust her despite every instinct telling him to keep his distance. "Why would you want to stay? Most people can't get away from here fast enough." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, still holding his injured hand in both of hers. His palm was calloused from ranch work, the fingers long and capable despite the neglect of his wound. "Maybe I'm not most people," she said finally. The simple honesty of her words hit Samuel like a physical blow. When was the last time someone had offered to help him without wanting something in return? When had anyone cared whether he properly tended his wounds or let them fester? "I don't pay much," he said gruffly, his way of accepting her offer. "Room and board is enough, plus whatever you think is fair when I leave." Maria had been watching this exchange with interest, and now she spoke up in rapid Spanish to Elena. Elena responded fluently, and Samuel caught enough to understand that Maria was offering to help gather medical supplies. "You speak Spanish," Samuel observed. "I grew up in California, spent time in communities where it was more useful than English." Elena released his hand but held his gaze. "Now let's take care of that cut before it gets worse." As Elena worked, cleaning the wound with gentle efficiency and wrapping it in fresh bandages, Samuel found himself studying her profile. There was something peaceful about her presence, something that made the kitchen feel more alive than it had in years. Her hands were sure and careful, and when she concentrated, she bit her lower lip in a way that reminded him of Margaret. The thought of his dead wife should have brought the familiar stab of pain, but instead, Samuel felt something else, a stirring of life he'd thought was gone forever. It terrified him. "There," Elena said, securing the bandage. "Change this every day and keep it dry. The infection should clear up in a few days." "Thank you." Samuel flexed his fingers, surprised by how much better the hand felt already. Elena began clearing the medical supplies, but Samuel caught her wrist gently. "Elena, what are you really running from?" Her dark eyes met his, and for a moment he saw a flash of the same pain that lived in his own heart. "The same thing you are, I think," she said quietly. "The past." Outside, Jake's voice called something about checking the cattle, and the spell of the moment broke. But as Samuel reached for his coat and Elena began helping Maria with the breakfast dishes, both of them felt the shift, the first tentative step toward something neither had expected to find again. Chapter 3. Broken Fences. 3 days had passed since the storm, and Elena had settled into the rhythm of ranch life with surprising ease. She rose before dawn to help Maria with breakfast, spent her mornings tending to Samuel's hand and checking on the ranch hands for any injuries, and her afternoons learning the countless tasks that kept Sunset Ranch running. Samuel watched her from across the corral as she helped Jake sort through a pile of damaged fence posts. The morning sun caught the highlights in her dark hair, and her laughter at something Jake said carried across the yard on the crisp air. It was a sound he hadn't heard on his property in 10 years, and it did something strange to his chest, made it feel both lighter and heavier at the same time. "She's got good hands," said Tom Bradley, one of his younger ranch hands, nodding toward Elena. "Fixed up my shoulder yesterday when I pulled it moving hay bales. Haven't felt this good in months." Samuel grunted in acknowledgement, but his eyes didn't leave Elena's figure. She wore one of Margaret's old work dresses that Maria had found for her, and seeing another woman in his wife's clothes should have felt like a betrayal. Instead, it felt like the dress had found its purpose again. "Boss," Jake's voice interrupted his thoughts. The foreman approached with Elena at his side, both of them covered in dust and wood shavings. "We've got a problem with the north pasture fence. Whole section came down in the storm, and we're talking about maybe 100 yards of posts and wire." Samuel's jaw tightened. The north pasture was where he kept his best breeding stock, and without a proper fence, they could wander onto the neighboring Hartwell property. James Hartwell had been trying to buy Samuel out for years, and he wouldn't hesitate to claim any cattle that strayed onto his land. "How long to fix it?" Samuel asked. "With just me and the boys? Week, maybe 10 days if the weather holds." "We don't have 10 days. Samuel kicked at a clod of dirt, frustration evident in every line of his body. Hartwell's been watching for any excuse to cause trouble. Eleanor had been listening quietly, but now she stepped forward. "What if you had more help?" Both men looked at her questioningly. "I can handle tools," she continued. "I helped my father build fences when I was younger. And there might be others in town who'd work for day wages." Samuel shook his head immediately. "I can't afford extra hands right now, and I won't have you doing that kind of heavy labor." "Why not?" Elena's chin lifted slightly, a gesture Samuel was beginning to recognize as her stubborn streak showing. "Because I'm a woman. Because you're a guest here, not what? Not someone who earns her keep." Eleanor's dark eyes flashed. "You gave me work, Samuel. Let me do it." The use of his first name sent an unexpected jolt through him. She'd been calling him Mr. McKenna since her arrival, maintaining a careful distance that he'd appreciated and resented in equal measure. Jake cleared his throat diplomatically. "Boss, she's got a point. And if she can swing a hammer, we could get that fence up in half the time." Samuel looked between them, recognizing that he was outnumbered. More than that, he could see the determination in Eleanor's face, the need to prove herself useful. He understood that feeling, the desperate desire to matter, to have purpose. "Fine," he said finally. "But you work with me, not with the other hands. And if I say you're done for the day, you're done." Elena smiled, and Samuel felt his heart skip in a way that scared him. Deal. They set out for the north pasture after lunch, riding in Samuel's wagon loaded with fence posts and tools. Eleanor sat beside him on the bench seat, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender soap in her hair. She'd braided it back practically, and wore work clothes that couldn't quite hide her feminine curves. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, as they bounced along the dirt road. "How long have you lived here?" Samuel was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, "Built the house in 1855, right after I married Margaret." She picked the spot, said she wanted to see the sunset from the kitchen window every evening. It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife's name aloud in years, and Elena heard the careful control in his voice. "She had good taste," Elena said gently. "It's beautiful land. Used to be bigger. Had to sell off parcels over the years to pay debts." Samuel's hands tightened on the reins. "Margaret always said this place would be something special someday. Support dozens of families, maybe even a small town. What happened to her?" The question hung in the air between them. Samuel pulled the wagon to a stop at the broken fence line and sat staring out at the scattered cattle beyond. "Childbirth," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Baby didn't make it either. Little girl. We were going to name her Sarah." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the raw pain in his voice. Without thinking, she reached over and placed her hand over his, where it gripped the wagon seat. His skin was warm and rough beneath her palm. "I'm sorry," she said, meaning it completely. Samuel looked down at their joined hands, and for a moment, Elena thought he might pull away. Instead, he turned his hand palm up and squeezed her fingers gently. "What about you?" he asked. "What brought you to my door in the middle of a blizzard?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, watching the cattle move slowly across the pasture. "I was engaged to a doctor in Sacramento," she said finally. "Dr. William Chambers. He was respected, successful. Was? He liked to control things, people, especially me." Elena's voice was steady, but Samuel could hear the effort it cost her. "At first it seemed like caring. He didn't want me working as a nurse anymore. Said his wife shouldn't need to work. Didn't want me visiting friends he hadn't approved. Didn't want me making decisions without consulting him first." Samuel felt anger building in his chest, hot and protective. "The night before our wedding, I realized I was about to become a prisoner in my own life. So I left, took what money I had and ran." Eleanor finally looked at him, her dark eyes steady. "I've been traveling for 3 weeks, trying to get far enough away that he won't follow. Any man who'd hurt a woman like you doesn't deserve to breathe the same air," Samuel said with quiet intensity. The simple declaration, spoken with such conviction, made Elena's breath catch. When was the last time someone had defended her without question, without asking what she might have done to deserve such treatment? They worked together through the afternoon, falling into an easy rhythm. Samuel would position the fence posts while Elena held them steady. Then she'd hand him tools as he secured the wire. She was stronger than she looked, and she didn't complain about the physical demands of the work. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that took Elena's breath away, they finished the last section of fence. Both were exhausted, covered in dirt and sweat, but there was satisfaction in the work completed. "Margaret was right," Elena said, watching the sunset from where they stood. "You can see everything from here." Samuel followed her gaze to the horizon, seeing his land through her eyes, the rolling hills, the distant mountains, the endless sky that seemed to go on forever. For the first time in years, he felt pride in what he'd built, instead of just sorrow for what he'd lost. "Elena," he said, not looking at her, "I'm glad you stayed." She turned to study his profile in the fading light, the strong jaw, the lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and pain, the way he held himself like a man who'd learned not to expect good things. "So am I," she said softly. As they loaded the tools back into the wagon, both of them felt the shift between them deepening. What had started as shelter from a storm was becoming something else entirely. something that both excited and terrified them in equal measure. Chapter 4. The Heart's Defenses. A week had passed since they'd repaired the north fence, and Elena had become an integral part of life at Sunset Ranch. She worked alongside Maria in the house during the mornings, tended to the minor injuries and ailments of the ranch hands, and spent her afternoons helping with whatever tasks needed doing. But it was the evenings that had become precious to both her and Samuel. After supper, when the work was done and the ranch hands had retired to the bunkhouse, Eleanor and Samuel would sit on the front porch if the weather was mild, or by the fireplace if it was cold. They talked about everything and nothing, books they'd read, places they'd seen, dreams they'd once held. Slowly, carefully, they were building something neither quite dared to name. Tonight was different, though. Samuel had been quiet during dinner, responding to Elena's attempts at conversation with distracted nods and one-word answers. Now, as she helped Maria clean the dishes, Elena could see him through the kitchen window, standing by the corral and staring out at the darkening sky. "He's thinking about her again," Maria said quietly in Spanish, following Elena's gaze. "Margaret? See, today would have been their wedding anniversary. 25 years. Maria dried her hands on her apron, her weathered face creased with concern. "Every year he disappears into that grief like it happened yesterday." Elena felt her heart squeeze with sympathy and something else, a sharp pang that might have been jealousy, though she had no right to such feelings. "Should I leave him alone?" "No, Mija. I think maybe this year he needs something different." Elena found Samuel exactly where she'd seen him from the window, leaning against the corral fence with his shoulders rigid with tension. The setting sun cast long shadows across the yard, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. "Samuel?" She approached cautiously, unsure of her welcome. He didn't turn around, but she saw his shoulders rise and fall with a deep breath. "You shouldn't be out here. Getting cold." "I don't mind the cold." Elena moved to stand beside him at the fence, close enough to offer comfort but not so close as to crowd him. "Maria told me what today is." Samuel's hands gripped the fence rail until his knuckles showed white. "Did she now? She cares about you. We all do." "Don't." The word came out sharp, almost harsh. "Don't pretend this is something it's not, Elena. You're passing through, remember? Moving on to California, to your new life." Eleanor felt the sting of his words, but she also heard the pain underneath them. "Is that what you want, for me to leave?" Samuel finally turned to look at her, and Eleanor was shocked by the raw anguish in his pale blue eyes. "What I want doesn't matter. What I want—" He stopped, shaking his head violently. "I loved her, Elena. Loved her more than my own life. And she died because of me." "Samuel, no, she died giving birth to my child." The words exploded out of him with years of pent-up guilt and rage. "If I hadn't gotten her pregnant, if I'd listened when she said she was tired, if I'd taken her to the doctor in town instead of trusting that midwife—" "Stop." Elena stepped closer, her hand reaching for his arm. "You can't blame yourself for what happened." Samuel jerked away from her touch. "Can't I? I'm the one who wanted children so badly. I'm the one who convinced her we should try again after she lost the first baby. I killed her with my selfishness." Elena felt tears burning her eyes at the pain in his voice. She understood now why he'd isolated himself, why he'd let the ranch deteriorate, why he flinched away from human connection. He'd been punishing himself for 10 years, carrying a guilt that was slowly destroying him. "She chose to have that baby," Eleanor said quietly. "She chose to try again because she loved you and wanted to build a family with you. That's not selfishness, Samuel. That's love." "Love." Samuel laughed bitterly. "Love is what killed her. And now what?" Samuel looked at her standing there in the fading light, her dark hair catching the last rays of the sun, her eyes full of compassion and something deeper that made his chest ache with longing. She was so alive, so vital, and being near her made him remember what it felt like to want something beyond mere survival. "Now I'm starting to feel things I have no right to feel," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "For you." Elena's breath caught at his admission. "Samuel, I see you every morning across the breakfast table, and I forget for a moment that I'm supposed to be dead inside. I watch you laugh with Maria or help Jake with the horses, and I want things I gave up the right to want 10 years ago." Samuel's eyes met hers, and Elena could see the war being fought in their depths. "You make me remember what it was like to be alive." Elena stepped closer, close enough that she could reach up and touch his face if she dared. "Then why are you fighting it?" "Because I can't lose someone else." The words came out raw and desperate. "I can't survive it again, Elena. I won't." Eleanor felt her heart breaking for this man who had loved so completely that the loss had nearly destroyed him. She understood his fear, his reluctance to risk his heart again, but she also saw something else in his eyes: hope struggling against despair, love fighting against fear. "You're not losing me," she said softly. "I'm right here, for now." "But what happens when you heal from whatever drove you here? What happens when you remember that you deserve better than a broken-down rancher who can't even keep his property running?" "What if I don't want better?" Eleanor's voice was barely audible. "What if I want this? This place, this life, you?" Samuel stared at her for a long moment, his breathing shallow and quick. Elena could see him wavering, caught between his desperate longing and his bone-deep fear. "I can't," he whispered finally, turning away from her. "I won't put you at risk. I won't be responsible for another woman's—" "Don't you dare finish that sentence." Eleanor's voice carried a steel that made Samuel's head snap back toward her. "I'm not Margaret, Samuel. I'm not some fragile flower who needs protecting from life. I've survived an abusive engagement, traveled halfway across the country alone, and nursed people through everything from gunshot wounds to cholera. I'm stronger than you think." Samuel looked at her, really looked, and saw the truth in her words. Elena Rodriguez was indeed strong, capable, resilient. She'd chosen to stay at his ranch, chosen to help him rebuild what grief had torn down, chosen to care about a man who'd given her every reason to walk away. "Eleanor," he said, her name a prayer on his lips. She stepped closer still, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her body. "I know you're scared. I'm scared too. But I'd rather be scared with you than safe without you." The simple honesty of her words shattered the last of Samuel's defenses. Without quite knowing how it happened, he found himself reaching for her, his work-roughened hands framing her face as if she were something precious and fragile. "If I do this," he said, his voice shaking, "if I let myself love you, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll fight. Whatever comes, whatever tries to take you from me, promise me you'll fight to stay." Elena covered his hands with hers, holding his gaze steadily. "I promise." And there, under the vast Wyoming sky, with the first stars beginning to appear overhead, Samuel McKenna kissed Elena Rodriguez with 10 years of loneliness and longing, while she kissed him back with all the hope and healing her heart could hold. Chapter 5. New Beginnings. Spring came early to Wyoming that year, and with it, a transformation at Sunset Ranch that went far beyond the changing seasons. Samuel stood in the doorway of the barn, watching Eleanor work with one of the new foals they'd acquired from a neighboring ranch. Her patience with the skittish animal was extraordinary. She spoke to it in soft Spanish, her movements slow and deliberate until the young horse allowed her to approach. 3 months had passed since that night when they'd finally admitted their feelings for each other, and in that time, everything had changed. The ranch showed signs of new life everywhere: fresh paint on the house, repaired fences, a vegetable garden that Elena had convinced Maria to help her plant behind the kitchen. More importantly, Samuel himself had changed. The hollow look in his eyes had been replaced by something Elena had put there: hope. "She's got the touch," Jake said, appearing at Samuel's elbow. The old foreman had been skeptical of Elena at first, but he'd become one of her strongest supporters. "Never seen a horse take to someone so quick." Samuel nodded, unable to take his eyes off Elena. She wore a blue dress that brought out the gold flecks in her dark eyes, and her hair was pinned up practically, though a few strands had escaped to frame her face. She was beautiful, but more than that, she was home. She'd become the heart of Sunset Ranch in a way that went beyond anything Samuel had dared to hope for. "Boss," Jake continued, his tone growing serious, "got word from town yesterday. That fellow's been asking questions again." Samuel's contentment evaporated instantly. "Chambers?" "Yep. Sheriff Henderson sent word that a fancy-dressed man from California has been showing Elena's picture around, offering a reward for information about her whereabouts." Samuel felt the familiar cold knot of fear form in his stomach. Dr. William Chambers had been a persistent shadow over their happiness for months now. Twice, Elena had spotted men in town who might have been looking for her, and each time, Samuel had seen the fear creep back into her eyes, the same fear that had driven her into the Wyoming blizzard in the first place. "How close is he?" Samuel asked. Henderson thinks he's still in Cheyenne, but working his way through all the small towns. It's only a matter of time before he gets here. Samuel watched Elena succeed in placing a halter on the foal, her face lighting up with quiet triumph. The thought of Chambers finding her, of taking her away or worse, made Samuel's chest tight with rage and terror. "We need to tell her," Jake said gently. Samuel nodded grimly. They'd been protecting Elena from the worst of the news about Chambers' search, but she deserved to know that her past was closing in on their present. That evening, after the ranch hands had retired and Maria had gone to her room, Samuel found Elena on the front porch, reading by lamplight. It was her favorite spot to spend the hour before bed, and Samuel had grown to love these quiet moments together. Tonight, however, he couldn't enjoy the peaceful scene. "Eleanor," he said, settling into the chair beside her, "we need to talk." Something in his tone made her set down her book immediately. "What's wrong?" Samuel took her hands in his, drawing strength from their warmth. "Chambers is getting closer. He's in Cheyenne asking questions." Eleanor went very still, and Samuel saw the color drain from her face. "How do you know?" "Sheriff Henderson sent word. He's offering a reward for information about you." Eleanor pulled her hands free and stood abruptly, pacing to the porch railing. In the moonlight, Samuel could see her shoulders trembling, whether from cold or fear, he couldn't tell. "I have to leave," she said quietly. "Tonight. Before he—" "No." Samuel stood and moved behind her, his hands settling on her shoulders. "You're not running anymore, Elena. We'll face this together." "You don't understand." Eleanor turned in his arms, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "William isn't just controlling Samuel. He's dangerous. When I left Sacramento, he threatened to have me declared mentally incompetent if I ever tried to leave him. He has friends, connections, money. He could have you arrested, claim you kidnapped me or worse." Samuel felt rage burn through him at the thought of any man threatening Elena that way. "Let him try. This is Wyoming, not California. Out here, a man's word and his actions count for more than money and connections. And if he brings the law with him? If he has papers claiming I'm his legal responsibility?" Samuel was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he lifted Elena's chin gently, forcing her to meet his eyes. "There's one way to make sure he has no legal claim on you." Elena searched his face, and understanding dawned slowly in her expression. "Samuel, marry me," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "I know it's not the proposal you deserve, not the romantic gesture you should have, but marry me, Eleanor. Be my wife in truth, not just in my heart." Eleanor stared at him, her mouth slightly open in shock. "You want to marry me to protect me from William?" "No." Samuel cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking across her cheekbones. "I want to marry you because I love you more than my own life. I want to marry you because you've brought joy back to this place, because you've made me remember what it means to hope for the future. I want to marry you because I can't imagine spending another day without you as my wife." Tears spilled over Elena's cheeks, but she was smiling. "Samuel McKenna, are you proposing to me on the front porch in the middle of the night because my former fiancé is hunting me down?" Despite everything, Samuel found himself smiling back. "I suppose I am. Not very romantic of me." Elena laughed, the sound bright and clear in the night air. "It's the most romantic thing I've ever heard." She rose on her toes and kissed him softly. "Yes, Samuel? Yes, I'll marry you." The wedding took place 3 days later in the small church in town, with Sheriff Henderson, Maria, Jake, and several of the ranch hands as witnesses. Elena wore Margaret's wedding dress, which Maria had carefully altered to fit her smaller frame. The dress was ivory silk with intricate lacework, and wearing it felt like receiving a blessing from Samuel's first wife, rather than competing with her memory. Samuel had been nervous about how he'd feel, seeing another woman in Margaret's dress, but when Elena walked down the aisle toward him, all he felt was gratitude. Margaret would have wanted him to be happy, would have wanted him to love again, and Elena, beautiful Elena, with her dark eyes shining with love and joy, was his second chance at happiness. "Do you, Samuel McKenna, take Elena Rodriguez to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Pastor Williams asked. Samuel looked into Elena's eyes and saw his future reflected there, not a replacement for what he'd lost, but something entirely new and precious. "I do. Do you, Elena Rodriguez, take Samuel McKenna to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Elena thought of the journey that had brought her here, the fear, the running, the desperate night in the blizzard that had led her to Samuel's door. It had all been worth it for this moment, for this man who loved her not despite her strength but because of it. "I do," she said firmly. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Samuel, you may kiss your bride." Samuel's kiss was gentle but thorough, full of promise and love. When they broke apart, Elena was breathless and smiling, and the small congregation erupted in cheers and applause. As they walked back down the aisle together, Elena caught sight of a familiar figure standing at the back of the church. Her step faltered, and Samuel immediately noticed her tension. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Elena's eyes were fixed on the man in the expensive suit, his pale face twisted with fury as he watched her with Samuel. "William," she whispered. Dr. William Chambers stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly through the church. "Elena, what is the meaning of this charade? Your promise to me." Samuel immediately stepped protectively in front of his new wife, his hand instinctively moving to the gun at his hip. "Dr. Chambers, I presume. You're not welcome here. And you must be the cowboy who's been harboring my fiancée." Chambers' voice was cultured and smooth, but there was steel underneath. "Elena is not of sound mind, Mr. McKenna. She ran away from her responsibilities in a fit of hysteria. I'm here to take her home." "The only hysteria I see," Sheriff Henderson said, stepping forward with his badge clearly visible, "is yours, Mr. Mrs. McKenna," he emphasized the name deliberately, "is a married woman now, and she's free to make her own choices." Chambers' face flushed red with anger. "This marriage is a sham. Eleanor, tell them you're coming home with me where you belong." Eleanor stepped out from behind Samuel, her chin lifted with quiet dignity. "The only thing I need to tell you, William, is goodbye. I'm not your property, and I never was. I'm exactly where I belong." For a moment, Chambers looked as though he might try to physically take Eleanor, but the sight of Samuel's hand on his gun and Sheriff Henderson's stern expression seemed to change his mind. "This isn't over," Chambers said, his voice low and threatening. "You can't hide from me forever, Elena. I know people, I have resources, and I have a wife to protect," Samuel interrupted, his voice deadly calm. "Dr. Chambers, I suggest you leave Wyoming. Today. And if you ever threaten my wife again, you'll discover that we handle things differently out here than they do in California." The promise of violence in Samuel's tone was unmistakable, and after a long moment, Chambers turned and stalked out of the church. Elena sagged against Samuel's side, the tension leaving her body all at once. "Is it really over?" she asked. Samuel wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. "It's over, Elena. You're safe now. You're home." As they left the church together, husband and wife, Eleanor looked back one last time at the life she'd left behind. Then she turned her face toward Sunset Ranch, toward the future she and Samuel would build together, and didn't look back again. 6 months later, as autumn painted the Wyoming landscape in gold and crimson, Eleanor stood in the kitchen garden harvesting the last of the season's vegetables. Her hands were dirty from the soil, her hair was escaping its pins, and she'd never been happier. Samuel appeared in the garden carrying their 3-month-old daughter, Sarah Margaret McKenna, named for both the woman who'd come before and the future they were building together. The baby had Samuel's pale blue eyes and Elena's dark hair, and she was the joy of everyone at Sunset Ranch. "She's getting hungry," Samuel said, settling beside Elena on the garden bench they'd built together in the spring. Elena reached for her daughter, settling the baby against her breast with practiced ease. Samuel watched them both with an expression of wonder that still took Elena's breath away, even after all these months of marriage. "Jake says the north pasture fence needs repairs again," Elena said, stroking Sarah's tiny fist as she nursed. "We'll get to it," Samuel replied, but his attention was focused on his wife and daughter. "Eleanor? Thank you." Eleanor looked up at him questioningly. "For what?" Samuel gestured around them, at the thriving garden, the well-maintained ranch buildings, the contented cattle in the distance. But mostly he looked at Eleanor and their daughter. "For saving my life. For giving me a reason to live again. For loving me despite everything." Eleanor shifted the baby to her shoulder and leaned against Samuel's side, watching the sun set over their land. "Thank you for opening your door that night. For taking in a stranger and giving her a home." Samuel kissed the top of Elena's head, breathing in the scent of her hair. "You were never a stranger, Elena. You were the answer to a prayer I didn't even know I was praying." As the stars began to appear in the vast Wyoming sky, the small family sat together in perfect contentment. Elena had stopped running and found her place in the world. Samuel had learned that love lost didn't mean love was over. It just meant his heart was big enough for more than one great love story. And Sunset Ranch, which had once been a monument to grief and loss, was now a testament to the healing power of love, the strength of second chances, and the truth that sometimes the greatest storms bring the greatest gifts. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate and Samuel smiled. Some songs he'd learned were worth singing twice,